My guest, Pamela Eisenbaum, says this interpretation of Paul is not only wrong, it's dangerous. Her new book is called Paul Was Not a Christian, the original message of a misunderstood apostle. Pamela Eisenbaum, welcome to Interfaith Voices.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So you begin the book with a testimony you heard from a man who had converted to Christianity. Can you tell us about that?
Yes. Well, it was Easter morning, and a friend asked me to go to church with her. It was a big church, and I said sure. As a scholar of early Christianity, I visited many churches, and I'm interested in visiting churches. So I went to church with her, and during the service, the pastor gave a sermon, and after the sermon invited this gentleman to come up and tell his story. And it was a story of his conversion to Christianity. And he narrates this story in which he talks about what a bad person he was in his past life before his conversion. And it turns out, as he's telling this story about how sinful and bad he was, that he was Jewish, that was his sin. And I was just in shock upon that moment. In fact, I left the church at that moment because I didn't really want to hear anymore.
And you say in the book that this kind of anti-Semitism kind of started with Paul. So how did the man known as the quintessential Christian become the father of anti-Semitism?
Paul is probably the most prominent convert to Christianity, regarded as the first convert to Christianity. You know, the other apostles like Peter and John and James were followers of the historical Jesus, so they don't exactly convert upon the resurrection. They're just followers of his teachings. Paul has this radical transformation on the road to Damascus, or so that's how he's been portrayed. And the way his letters have been read and the way the story is told in the book of Acts, that moment causes Paul to perceive Judaism as having caused his alienation from God, and Jesus is having restored his relationship with God.
So is this a standard way of seeing Judaism as kind of a flawed religion that needed to be perfected by Christianity?
Yes, absolutely. It's been a long-standing view of Judaism, that it was somehow inadequate. Also that Judaism itself expected this Messiah. That Messiah came, and then the Jews themselves didn't even recognize that he was the Messiah. And so Judaism has been, ridiculed and portrayed literally as a bad religion. In fact, more literally, Judaism has been portrayed as a kind of opposite religion of Christianity, where Christianity is a highly spiritual religion, a religion of faith, believing in a gracious God and all these kinds of things. And Judaism is portrayed as this religion of doing these tedious little works. You have to do all sorts of absurd little things to be Jewish. And the belief is in a God who's not at all merciful, but rather wrathful. I mean, after all, isn't the God of the Old Testament terribly wrathful and mean and killing people all the time? And so the two religions, in the Christian mind, the two religions became constructed literally as opposites with one another.
So you really trace it back to the way Christian interpreters have read Paul over the centuries.
Absolutely. One of the reasons the image of Paul became so distorted later in Christianity by Christian interpreters is that they utilized sources for understanding Paul that really weren't very good sources. Several letters in the New Testament are ascribed to Paul, but really most scholars only believe 7 of those letters, whereas there's another 6 ascribed to Paul. Only 7 of those letters really represent Paul's own thoughts. And so when you read those letters, you get a different image of Paul than when you read all the letters together.
And in fact, the central argument of your book is that Paul lived and died a Jew.
Absolutely. There are no Christian institutions. The word Christian hasn't been invented yet, never mind the word Christianity. And he calls himself a Jew in several cases. Sometimes he really emphasizes it. He'll say, I'm a Hebrew born of Hebrews. I'm of the tribe of Benjamin. In other words, he'll make this point really emphatically. And yet, ironically, people viewed him as having left that identity behind, even though he calls himself that in the present at the time of his letters. And he explicitly says he's not a Gentile.
And why do you think this idea of Paul the Jew is hard for Jews and Christians to accept?
That's a great question. If you add up all the letters in the New Testament that have been ascribed to Paul, let me say that. I don't think all of them are written by Paul, but all the letters that have been ascribed to Paul, you get about half the New Testament. And because of that, Paul is incredibly influential and authoritative. And so to try to construct a different image of Paul is very hard. And on the Jewish side, let me answer that on the Jewish side. Jews have viewed Paul basically like Christians have, only in reverse. In other words, Jews say, okay, yes, Paul totally rejected Judaism. He condemned it. He said nasty and horrible things. He didn't even understand what Judaism is. And because he said all these horrible things, he's basically the greatest of Jewish heretics. Because he said all these things, we've suffered under Christian anti-Semitism all this time. So that's been the traditional Jewish portrait of Paul, at least until very recently, where I'm certainly not the first Jewish person to write a book on Paul. There have been a few others recently that have begun to see Paul in these more Jewish terms.
Do you really think that changing our reading of Paul will have any real effect on anti-Semitism? I mean, isn't this view of Paul too ingrained and anti-Semitism kind of too complicated? I mean, how will changing the way we read Paul trickle down into how everyday people see Jews?
I think it will take a long time, but I'm relatively optimistic. Because again, I have the privilege of teaching at the Aleph School of Theology, this Christian School of Theology. I teach students studying for the ministry, and they've actually told me that, for a long time they just avoid preaching on Paul because they think his message is so negative toward Jews and others. But after they have my class, at least many of them have this aha moment and this positive understanding of Paul, and they can integrate him into their preaching. And then I hope people in the pews hear that kind of new orientation to Paul, and then hopefully it just progresses from there.
So you're a Jew in this Christian institution, you said, the Aleph School of Theology.
Yep.
Has that status made you aware of your own Judaism and maybe even made you feel some kind of kinship with Paul as the kind of odd one out?
That's a great question as well, a very insightful question. The quick answer is yes, absolutely. Both that teaching in a Christian school has made me more consciously Jewish, and yes, I very much identify with Paul, and I'm sure that was a big part of my attraction to Paul. Paul lives as a Jew among Gentiles, and, well, so do I.
Pamela Eisenbaum is the Associate Professor of Biblical Studies and Christian Origins